En nombre de Equilibrium Global, tengo el agrado de saludarles e invitarlos a compartir esta nueva sección que hemos tenido con Vladimir Radunovic, experto de la Fundación Diplom y referente en estudios sobre diplomacia digital y ciberseguridad. Es un nuevo video que tendremos en nuestra sección de diplomacia, en el canal de YouTube de Equilibrium Global. Para introducir brevemente a nuestra audiencia, Diplo es una organización no gubernamental suizo-maltesa, especializada en el desarrollo de capacidades en el ámbito de la gobernanza de Internet y la política digital. Creada en 2002, trabaja, entre otros objetivos, para mejorar el papel de los estados pequeños y el desarrollo de la diplomacia mundial. Antes de avanzar y escuchar el video, les invito a una acción muy simple y sencilla, que tiene un significado para nosotros. No dejen de suscribirse, darle like al video y compartir el material. Es una señal de apoyo hacia nuestra organización, a los contenidos que presentamos y especialmente a nuestra intención de difundir aquello que está sucediendo en la agenda internacional. Acerca de nuestro entrevistado, es profesor de política de ciberseguridad, gobernanza de Internet y diplomacia electrónica en cursos de posgrado y profesionales. También es experto de la plataforma de Internet de Ginebra. Ha sido miembro del Consejo Asesor del Foro Global de Ciberexperiencia, de 2016 a 2018 y de 2018 a 2020, y miembro del Grupo Asesor Multisectorial del Foro de Gobernanza de Internet de la ONU, de 2012 a 2014. Su actividad profesional e investigadora se centra en la gobernanza de Internet, la política de banda ancha, la neutralidad de la red, la ciberseguridad, la ciberdiplomacia, la diplomacia electrónica y el desarrollo de capacidades.
We can probably start with understanding, or a provocation if you wish, understanding that there is no more cyberspace. There is no more cyberspace. The reason why I say that is wherever you turn around yourself, whether it's the government services, or it is the banking, or businesses, communications, schools, even basic aspects of our lives, like family communications and some sensitive documents, or photos of your kids. All of that is in this small device, right? And all of that is somewhere digitalized. So cyber has basically penetrated every single aspect of our life. And it used to be, when we talked about cybersecurity or cyber policy, that you were looking at some special group of people that had to have some specific technical knowledge. Not anymore like that. The point of this, why I'm putting this provocation, is that cybersecurity is basically now a component of every aspect of life, and every aspect of security, and every aspect of public policy, and every aspect of business, right? And the stakes are getting higher. Back in the days when cybersecurity became a risk, let's say, when we started with some digital services, you mainly had some geeks and maybe hackers, in whether in positive or negative way, but some people that just wanted to play with technology and find the vulnerabilities and exploit them and hack and so on. Then you got some petty criminals. Then you got the cybercrime groups, serious organized global cybercrime groups. And then you got and we'll talk about later, we got the states involved in that. And the targets of those attacks and the stakes about them have moved from having your account lost, let's say username and password hacked, to having your bank account lost, meaning someone gets your money, to putting down the critical infrastructure, let's say the energy power plant, the heating, or the water supplies even, the hospitals, to the moment when we, 2 years ago, have seen probably the first victim of cyber attacks against hospital in Germany, where a lady died because the hospital that she was supposed to be admitted to was under a cyber attack. She had to be transported to another one. She died, whether because of that or not directly, it doesn't matter. So the stakes are getting higher. It's not protecting our computers anymore. It's not protecting our data anymore only. It's also protecting the society, protecting the values of the society, democracy. We see elections being hacked and so on, disinformation, and then ultimately to lives and the whole society. And the last very important bit in this part, why it's important, what are the risks, is that many of us usually say, why would someone actually attack me? Why am I so important that someone would hack me or take some information from me? And that's to some extent true, but you always have, because criminals can operate in cyberspace globally, and someone from Argentina, where you are, can hack someone in Serbia, where I'm, or vice versa. So they have interest in robbing just anyone. They can pickpocket anyone around the world. So yes, you can be a victim. But more importantly, we are becoming a weapon. It means that if my computer or my smartphone is hacked, and I'm connected to my company might be a provider of service to a government or energy sector, this whole chain of supply can be compromised because I was compromised. And ultimately, the hackers can use me to get into, let's say, secrets of the government, which I'm absolutely not connected to directly, but through a couple of iterations that can happen. And that brings a lot of questions of our ethical responsibility, the legal responsibility. So yes, we are targets, whether because we are targets or because we are weapons. And that is a whole game shift in a way. If we look at geopolitical aspects of cybersecurity, and that is a very important thing, we can see that more and more, if you look at diplomatic agenda, for instance, today, and even the political agendas of the governments, particularly developed countries, but more and more developing countries as well, and that happens in Latin America also, you see that cybersecurity is getting to the agenda. Digitalization has been on the agenda for quite some time in many countries, because it was a need to boost the services, government services, business services, banking services, whatever, right? E-schools, particularly during the COVID times, right? But what was missing usually was this security aspect, not just security, digital policies in general. That means security, but also that means connectivity. That means e-commerce and costs and taxation. That also means human rights and privacy, particularly. And these policy aspects were to some extent neglected. They're not following the pace of digitalization, unfortunately, but they should be. They're the same, the two sides of the same coin. But now we see more and more because, as I mentioned, the stakes in cybersecurity are getting higher and the risks are higher for both citizens and national security. We see cybersecurity coming to the forefront of the political, diplomatic agenda, geopolitical relations, and so on. And I mentioned that we used to have different threat actors, from hackers to criminals, to organized criminal groups. What was a game changer was actually the step in of the governments. So once the governments understood that if they develop their own capabilities for hacking into other systems, and governments have almost unlimited resources, funds, people, and motivation, certainly, that was a game changer. So you suddenly got increasing number of governments, and what we follow in Diplo, it's about 50 that we can say that have some offensive cyber capabilities. 25 or more officially say that they are able to hack into systems of other countries. Those capabilities are very useful for hybrid warfare, for influence cross-border. Whether you would do that through hacking, through some cyber espionage, which we have seen in case of SolarWinds, famous case of SolarWinds hack against the US government, leaking number of thousands of secret documents, confidential documents, whether extending the influence through the, let's say, disinformation campaigns and playing with Facebook, Instagram, and other influence and so on. So those are very, very good tools for governments to influence other states, even in times of peace, whatever we call peace today, right? And there is a lot of interesting aspects of this weaponry and how governments use these capabilities, and we can talk more about that. But one of them is that you don't necessarily, as a small state, for instance, you don't necessarily have to have your own national capabilities to influence other states. You can actually play with criminal groups, so you can tolerate sophisticated criminal groups in your country, operating from your country. And in a way, either turn a blind eye to that, so that you let them hack your sort of opponents, but in tacit agreement, they're not going to get after you, or you even use them as a proxies for attacks to others. Now, whether all of these things are allowed or not, and what the international law says, and so on, we can talk more about that. But all of that presents a huge influence and a huge importance to geopolitical discussions. And if you look at discussions within the UN or G7 or G20, you have issues on the agenda such as cybersecurity in these terms of warfare, conflict. You have issues such as combating cybercrime. You have issues of strengthening e-commerce in terms of making more resilient systems. You have issues about cyber espionage, both the political and particularly the business or economic cyber espionage. So all these things are really of high geopolitical interest, and it will increasingly be so. It's definitely not the issue just in Latin America, cybercrime, and even the lack of this political awareness to some extent. Getting back to digitalization, as we said, that everything is getting digitalized, but literally everything. And that means everything can be hacked. And that means that ordinary citizens are having problems from what is known to be Nigerian scams, but it's not fair to the Nigerians. So the scams generally, and those fake princes which are offering money in return for just peanuts and so on, to hacking of the banking accounts, to all of that, to hacking, as I mentioned, of the serious industries such as, well, it was the Latin American very important, very well-known case of the hack of the world, or ransomware, against the world's biggest meat producer, JBS, which had to pay, I think, $11 million for cybercrime ransom. So these things are hurting the economy. It's not just the citizens anymore. They're hurting the economy at large. And there is no easy solution for that. When you have a robber in your house, you would usually turn to police. You can't really do that you should do that, but the police can't help you much when it comes to cybercrime, because it's global. So there needs to be a very strong international cooperation. There are many obstacles in that. The police has to have, and law enforcement has to have capacities for that. They have to act very promptly in order to preserve the evidences, to exchange them around the world, to try to prosecute usually foreigners or people operating around the world. Sometimes it's really hard to track, even if it's a local criminal, but they use these proxy systems to hide where they're acting from, so they can mask that they're attacking from China or wherever, they're actually sitting in another place. It's really tough. And that starts to impact the political credibility of the political players, of the governments, because they don't have mechanisms to react to ordinary problems of citizens. And that starts impacting the elections soon, at least in developed countries. But I'm very optimistic, if you want, that this will come to the agenda of the elections in developing countries as well very soon. That will be one of the aspects that's deciding the elections. Now, what can we do about it? And what are the experiences from some of the countries which are more advanced? It's not always necessarily the most developed countries. Yes, they're usually also advanced. They have more resources and time to invest in combating cybercrime. But there are other good examples around the world of countries which are dealing with that. So there is a number of steps we can and we should do. One is boosting and investing in local capacities of the law enforcement authorities, judicial system, police, to be able to investigate cybercrimes, which are specific when it comes to digital evidence, preserving, finding, and so on. Boosting the cross-border cooperation among the countries. As I said, most of the crimes are actually international or cross-border, which means harmonizing the laws across the country so that we all talk about the same thing. What is a crime? How do we prosecute it? What are the accepted evidences? How do we process them? And there are mechanisms. For instance, there is this practical mechanism called the Budapest Convention by the Council of Europe. Now, it is the European mechanism, but there is over 65 countries, many of them not coming from Europe, some of them coming from the Caribbean, Latin America as well, which are signatories to that convention, because it's very practical. It helps harmonizing the laws. It helps training the law enforcement and police and so on. So that is a very good instrument that helps. And at the same time, there are currently negotiations in the United Nations about the possible global treaty on combating cybercrime. Now, that treaty would possibly also introduce some incentives for harmonization of the laws, but it adds a political commitment of the heads of states or the governments themselves, because it will be a binding treaty, to adhere to what is agreed. That's a long process. It has a lot of politics in that. There's a lot of play how to embed what we already have, like Budapest Convention agreements, within this global treaty. And we at Diplo follow very closely what's happening in this ad hoc committee and the United Nations in the next 2-3 years. We'll see what happens. And by the way, the American examples are also the Organization of American States has worked a lot on cybercrime as well, at least on this regional level. So that's something that's precious to explore as well and build on in Latin America. This war in Ukraine somehow placed these discussions about cybersecurity to a very, very practical ground. And there were a lot of discussions. How could cybersecurity, how could cyber attacks be used in context of war? But this is the first unfortunate example where we can, in a way, testify. And the predictions of many experts were that in the preparation of the war and also during the war, we could expect a lot of cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, which would enable the parties to conquer the opponent more easily. What everyone got surprised to some extent was that we haven't seen much of that, at least not those highly sophisticated attacks against Ukraine right before and during the war thus far. For instance, we have had a huge, very sophisticated cyber operation against the Ukrainian energy grid back in 2015, when in December, which knows to be quite cold in Ukraine, one of the major energy suppliers was hacked. The whole power plant was put down by a hack, and about 200,000 people were left without electricity for days. So people were expecting something like that would happen again. It didn't happen. There are many possible arguments why it didn't really happen, from the fact that once you roll out the conventional weapons, there is certain advantage you can get with cyber weapons, but you have missiles, and it's quite a different game. And that cyber is probably more convenient as a hybrid warfare, as under this threshold of armed attack, where you actually want to hide that you're influencing the other party, and they can't necessarily react with fighting back. Once you open a kinetic war, it's different game. There are other possible arguments, but what is interesting is now, on one hand, what can be done during the warfare, and that means you can put down the government in parts of the country which is maybe not conquered yet, so that you cause panic. You can use social networks and disinformation campaigns to grow the fear. You can probably put down the communication networks to cripple the communication efforts of the other party, which we have to some extent seen, but not as much as we expected. But what is much more interesting is what goes beyond cybersecurity. And that is, for instance, in this war in Ukraine, the effects of, let's say, sanctions or broader set of digital measures done by the West against Russia, for instance, in terms of content, cutting down the content which goes to Ukraine, or services which go to Ukraine. As we know, that a number of US companies have cut down their services for Russia, financial, streaming, social networks, name it. Then the use of cryptocurrencies, for instance, in these situations. Then the impact of sanctions on, let's say, supply chain of software. The security, such as we've seen the case where Kaspersky was suddenly proclaimed as insecure and sort of persona non grata in the US, Germany, in spite of their great cooperation in the past and great trust. And so those are the things we haven't thought about, and they're having a huge impact on a global level, not just Russia, Ukraine. And they'll have a huge impact on how we see the governance, global governance of internet, and what the other countries will have as positions in future negotiations and their national policies. And to some extent, this trend of governments wanting to be digitally sovereign, digitally independent, which is hardly possible and still in these times of huge interconnectivity. But this is changing geopolitically. And on the other hand, we see the discussions about how some agreed norms and international law, after all, which exists for 60, 70 years already after the Second World War, how does it apply to cyberspace? And how does it, what do we agree, how does it apply as states? And there is a certain agreement among all the states achieved in a couple of previous years in the United Nations. And how does it play in practice once you have the conflict actually on the ground? And in Diplo, for instance, we are following this process in the United Nations, which is called the Open-Ended Working Group. So anyone who is interested can visit the Digital Watch Observatory and find the Open-Ended Working Group and group of governmental experts and see what's happening over there. It will be interesting to follow how these cyber aspects will evolve in future of the conflict and after the conflict. That's always a good question. Can we catch up, or can the law catch up with technology? Because it's usually much slower. But there are actually many mechanisms that we have to deploy at the same time. So if we look back at what are the risks, in the information security, we would usually say the risk is a combination of the value of assets that we want to protect. And we mentioned at the beginning that spans from a personal bank account to lives and values in democratic systems and critical infrastructure, so value of assets. The second component that makes the risk is the vulnerabilities, as you mentioned, vulnerabilities. And then the third one is the threats. Who's actually attacking you? And we mentioned criminals to petty hackers to states. Vulnerabilities are huge. The more we get digitalized, the more we get vulnerable systems, both in terms of software and in terms of humans. Humans are the weakest link still, the most vulnerable part. 90% of all the attacks have some human component in that, whether it's social engineering and phishing as the start of the attack or not. So how do you reduce vulnerabilities in your society and globally? You have to make digital products, the software, the hardware, more secure. You have to make sure that the producers, the vendors, produce more secure software and hardware and products. You do that through the regulation. You do that through the standards. You do that through the even the ethical aspects of roles of all the players, the businesses, the users, the government, and so on a national and on international level. And then when you look at the threats that I mentioned, so you have to combat cybercrime somehow, so fight against the criminals or demotivate them. You do that by increasing the costs for conducting cybercrime, whether that means because the systems are more secure, so they have to invest more in order to be able to hack, or because the prosecution is more efficient, and then ultimately they end up behind the bars, wherever they are hiding around the world. So combating the crime, but also combating the state's misbehavior in cyberspace, the state's intentions to hack each other. And how do you do that? You do that on one hand by more clear regulation on national level, what is allowed, awareness among the state actors what is allowed, and secondly, the international mechanism. I mentioned the negotiations in the UN and the applicability of international law. All the states agree that the existing international law applies to cyberspace. The question is how? What does it mean, armed attack in cyberspace? When do you actually say, now I'm attacked in cyberspace? Is it enough if a bank is hacked? Or you have to be without electricity, or you have to have victims, or it's cyber espionage. Where is that limit, right? And then there is a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of work on the regional level. And in the Organization of American States, for instance, you have huge efforts in the last 10 years at least, where the states are trying to put up a cybersecurity strategy on a regional level, how to encourage states to build their own national systems, how to make them talk to each other, increase confidence in cooperation, avoid misunderstanding and miscalculation when they run cyber attacks and so on. And the last question is, most of these things are voluntary measures. There are certain things which are binding, but it's really hard to get to any binding agreements on a global or regional level. It's politically hard, it's diplomatically hard. But even when you have binding agreements, they get broken every day. International law gets broken every day, right? So there is much on the voluntary level. There's huge discussion. Is it sufficient? Can we actually hold someone accountable if it's voluntary? Well, we have to work on that. It's really the feeling of being responsible by each one of us, by states, by businesses, by civil society users. We have to take certain responsibility as actors in that. And once we understand our own responsibility and roles, I guess it will be easy.
Agradecemos su compañía y atención. Esperemos que este material haya resultado de interés y utilidad. Para nosotros así lo fue, y disfrutamos mucho la experiencia de conversar con Vlada en este primer contacto con la comunidad de diplo.edu. Recuerden que este video se va a encontrar en nuestra sección de diplomacia, en el canal de Equilibrium Global de YouTube. Entonces, en nombre de Equilibrium Global, les agradezco nuevamente por su atención.